My name is Madeline, and 12 years ago, I met James at a business networking event. He was a senior manager at a trading company, charming and intelligent, with kind eyes that made me feel at ease. What really won me over, though, was how he talked about his 13-year-old daughter, Sarah. The love in his voice when he mentioned her name was unmistakable. I'd built my chain of beauty salons from the ground up, and success had brought me everything except what I wanted most, a family. I couldn't have children of my own, a fact I'd learned to live with, but meeting James and Sarah felt like a second chance. We got married 6 months later, and they moved into my house. The income difference between James and me was substantial. I made several times what he did, but it never bothered me. Love isn't about money, and I was just happy to finally have the family I'd always wanted. When Sarah turned 16, I bought her first car, a safe, reliable model that made her squeal with joy. "This is really mine," she'd asked, tears in her eyes as she hugged me. "Thank you, Madeline. You're the best." 2 years later, when college acceptance letters started arriving, I didn't hesitate to offer to pay for her education. It wasn't Harvard, but it was a good school, and Sarah was thrilled. Those early years were beautiful. We were happy. I had everything I'd ever wanted, a loving husband, a stepdaughter who seemed to appreciate me, and a home filled with laughter. Sarah even stayed with us after college, saying she wanted to save money while starting her career. I'll never forget that spring evening when Sarah came home practically glowing with excitement. She'd been dating Michael for 2 years, and I knew him well, a decent young man who worked as a software engineer and treated her like a princess. Still, when she burst through the door waving her left hand with a diamond ring sparkling on it, I was genuinely surprised. "Dad, Madeline," he proposed, she squealed, bouncing on her toes like she was 16 again instead of 25. "We're getting married." James jumped up to hug her while I stood there grinning like an idiot. This was exactly the kind of family moment I'd always dreamed of having. Michael came over later that evening, and we opened a bottle of champagne I'd been saving for a special occasion. "I know this is a big ask," Sarah said, looking nervous as she played with her engagement ring. "But we've been looking at venues and everything, and—" "How much?" I asked, already reaching for my phone to check my accounts. "Well, with everything included, around $150,000, she said quietly, then rushed to add, "But of course, we don't expect—" "Done," I interrupted, smiling. "I'll set up an account tomorrow that you can access for all the wedding expenses." The look of relief and joy on her face made every penny worth it. "Really? Oh my God, Madeline, thank you so much." She threw her arms around me, and I hugged her back tightly, remembering that teenage girl who'd first welcomed me into her life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of excitement. Sarah included me in everything at first. We'd sit at the kitchen table late into the night, looking at wedding magazines and Pinterest boards. She'd text me pictures of dresses she was considering and ask my opinion on color schemes. "What do you think about these flowers?" she'd ask, showing me photos of elaborate bouquets. "Too much? Not enough?" "I love the pink peonies," I'd say, and she'd make notes in her wedding planner. She found her dream dress, a stunning designer gown that cost more than my first car, and I didn't even blink at the price tag. The way her eyes lit up when she tried it on was worth every cent. The venue she chose was spectacular, an elegant historic hotel downtown with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. The menu she selected featured premium dishes that would impress any food critic. I transferred the money as promised, and Sarah dove into the planning with enthusiasm. But then, about 2 months into the planning, something shifted. The detailed updates became shorter, vaguer. Instead of our long planning sessions, she'd rush through dinner and disappear into her room or go to Michael's place. "How's the planning going?" I'd ask. "Fine," she'd reply, barely looking up from her phone. "Everything's on track." When I'd try to get more specific details, she'd give non-committal answers. "Oh, just finalizing some things." Or, "Don't worry, it's all under control." I told myself not to be hurt by this gradual exclusion. After all, planning a wedding is stressful, and she was probably just overwhelmed. Maybe she needed some space to make her own decisions. I remembered being young and wanting to prove I could handle things on my own. James noticed my concern one night as we got ready for bed. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seem worried." "I'm probably just being silly," I said, trying to smile. "It's just, Sarah seems different lately. More distant." "She's just busy with the wedding," he assured me, kissing my forehead. "You know how it is, so many details to manage. Try not to worry." I nodded and tried to push my concerns aside. But there was a nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right. The happy bubble we'd been living in felt like it was starting to develop tiny cracks, and I couldn't shake the sensation that this was just the beginning. As the weeks passed, I decided to take a more active role in the wedding planning again. One morning, over coffee, I casually brought up something that had been on my mind. "Sarah, honey, I was wondering about the guest list," I said, watching her scroll through her phone. "Have you figured out how many people you're inviting?" She looked up briefly. "Oh, yeah, we're keeping it small, about 50 people." "That's nice, intimate," I nodded, then added, "I'd love to include my parents and my sister. They've always adored you, and they'd be thrilled to be there." The change in Sarah's expression was immediate and startling. Her face hardened, and she put down her phone with deliberate slowness. "Actually, we're only inviting close relatives and friends. This is supposed to be a really personal celebration. I don't want to include people who aren't, actually family." The words hit me like ice water. After 12 years, after everything we'd shared, my family wasn't actually family to her? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice gentle. "Sarah, I understand wanting to keep things intimate, but my parents have known you since you were 13. They'd been to every one of your birthdays, your graduation." I paused, then added quietly, "And I am paying for the entire wedding. Surely we can make an exception for 3 people who care about you." Her face immediately twisted into a pout, and I could see the anger flash in her eyes at the mention of money. She pushed her chair back from the table with more force than necessary. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll send invitations to your mom and sister. Happy now?" Before I could respond, she grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen. I heard the front door slam a few minutes later. That evening, James came into our bedroom with that look on his face, the one that told me I wasn't going to like what he had to say. "We need to talk about what happened with Sarah today," he began, sitting on the edge of our bed. "Okay," I said, putting down my book. "What about it?" "She called me crying earlier. Said you were really rude to her about the guest list. She's staying at Michael's tonight because she's so upset." I stared at him in disbelief. "Rude to her?" "James, she told me my family wasn't welcome at her wedding, a wedding I'm paying for, by the way. And I stayed completely calm when I talked to her about it." "I know, but maybe you could be a little more gentle with her," he suggested. "She's under a lot of stress with the wedding planning." I explained exactly what had happened, word for word, and I could see him processing it. He ran his hand through his hair, something he always did when he was troubled. "Okay," he finally said. "I see what you mean. I'll talk to her about it tomorrow." The next 2 weeks passed in an uneasy peace. Sarah had returned home and was acting as if nothing had happened, chattering about wedding details over breakfast and asking my opinion about centerpieces again. But something felt off, like the calm before a storm. Then came the bombshell at dinner. "So," Sarah said, pushing her pasta around her plate, "Mom found out about the wedding. She's back in town." I nearly choked on my wine. James's fork clattered against his plate. In 12 years, Sarah's mother, Linda, had barely been mentioned in our house. I knew the basics. She'd had a drinking problem, which led to the divorce, then moved to Arizona and essentially abandoned Sarah. No birthday cards, no Christmas calls, nothing. "She really wants to be involved in the wedding planning," Sarah continued, her voice bright with an enthusiasm I couldn't understand. "Actually, I invited her over for dinner this weekend. Here. My hand tightened around my wine glass. This was my house, the house I'd bought with my own money, the house where I'd created a home for us all. The proper thing would have been for Sarah to ask permission before inviting someone over, especially someone with Linda's history. But I remembered the guest list argument and bit my tongue. One more confrontation wasn't worth it. James sat there silently, suddenly very interested in his pasta. That weekend, I spent hours preparing a perfect dinner: herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted vegetables, homemade bread. I wanted everything to be flawless, though I couldn't explain why I felt the need to impress a woman who'd abandoned her daughter. Linda arrived exactly 30 minutes late. She was tall and blonde like Sarah, but with hard edges where Sarah was soft. Her eyes scanned every inch of my home as she walked in, lingering on the artwork, the furniture, the view from the windows. I recognized the look: envy poorly disguised as appraisal. "What a large house," she said, emphasizing large in a way that made it sound like an insult. Dinner started pleasantly enough, but it didn't stay that way. Linda took a bite of the lamb and pursed her lips. She said, cutting another piece with deliberate slowness. "You know, I always made this with rosemary and garlic. It really brings out the flavor better. Sarah used to love it when I made it." I took a sip of wine and said nothing. "And these vegetables," she continued, pushing them around her plate. "They're a bit overdone, aren't they? I always found that keeping them crispy makes them so much more appetizing." With each criticism, I waited for James to say something, anything. He'd been married to this woman, he knew exactly who she was and what she was doing. But he kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his food into smaller and smaller pieces. I sat there, watching this woman criticize my cooking in my own home, while my husband stayed silent and my stepdaughter beamed at her long-lost mother as if she'd hung the moon. Something inside me shifted, hardened. As dinner wound down, Linda dabbed her lips with her napkin and turned to Sarah. "So, honey, tell me about the venue. Which hotel did you pick?" "The Grand Morrison downtown," Sarah replied, brightening at the change of subject. "It's beautiful, Mom. They have these amazing crystal chandeliers and—" "The Grand Morrison?" Linda's face wrinkled with distaste. "Oh, sweetie, you can't have your wedding there. That place is so basic. Now, the Belmont Plaza, that's where you should be having it. Much more prestigious." I gripped my fork tighter, knowing the Belmont Plaza cost nearly twice what we were already spending. "The wedding we're planning isn't exactly cheap," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The Grand Morrison is a lovely venue." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Well, you can't cut corners on your only daughter's wedding. It's the most important day of her life." Something inside me snapped. 12 years of love, support, and financial sacrifice reduced to cutting corners by a woman who hadn't sent her daughter so much as a birthday card. "If you're so concerned about the venue," I said, meeting her gaze directly, "feel free to pay for the Belmont Plaza yourself. Since I'm the one covering the entire $150,000 for this wedding, I think the Grand Morrison will do just fine." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face flushed red. She stood up so quickly, her chair scraped against the floor. "I can see I'm not welcome here," she announced, grabbing her purse. "Sarah, call me tomorrow, honey." She stormed out, the front door slamming behind her. Sarah whirled on me, her face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" she screamed. "How dare you throw the money in Mom's face like that? You're cruel and greedy, and you've ruined everything." She ran upstairs, and I heard her door slam too. I sat there, stunned, as James helped himself to another glass of wine. Later that night, he came to our bedroom looking stern. "You need to apologize to Sarah," he said. "What you said to Linda was completely out of line." I stared at him in disbelief. "Apologize? For what? Telling the truth? Your ex-wife came into my house, criticized everything I did, and then suggested I was being cheap about a wedding I'm paying for entirely on my own. Still, you didn't have to embarrass her like that. And now Sarah's upset." "I'm not apologizing," I said firmly. Not this time. He grabbed his pillow. Fine. I'll sleep in the living room until you come to your senses. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee alone in the kitchen. It was my mother. "Maddie, honey," she said, her voice concerned. "I wanted to ask you about Sarah's wedding. What's the date and venue?" "Dad and I haven't received an invitation yet, and neither has Jenny. I thought they must have gotten lost in the mail." I sat at the kitchen counter for hours after my mother's call, my coffee going cold beside me. The morning sun crawled across the floor as I waited, my anger building with each passing minute. Around 11, I heard Sarah's key in the lock. She'd been out since breakfast, probably with Linda. "Sarah," I called out, my voice steady, despite the rage simmering inside me. "We need to talk." She walked into the kitchen, still wearing yesterday's clothes. "What is it?" she asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "I just got a call from my mother," I said, watching her face carefully. She was asking about the wedding invitations, the ones that apparently never arrived. Sarah's expression hardened, a look I'd never seen before crossing her face. She lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm not inviting them." "Excuse me?" "I'm not inviting strangers to my wedding," she said, each word deliberately cruel. The word strangers hit me like a physical blow. My parents had been at every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone for 12 years. My sister had helped Sarah prepare for her college interviews. Strangers? "That's wrong, Sarah," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "And it's ugly. These people have loved you and supported you for years." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound I'd never heard from her before. "You want to talk about ugly? After what you did to my mom last night?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "Actually, you know what? I don't want you at my wedding either." Time seemed to stop. The kitchen fell silent except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. 12 years of love, support, and sacrifice reduced to this moment. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You don't want me, the person paying for your entire wedding, to attend?" "That's right," she said, lifting her chin higher. I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. All the hurt and anger of the past few weeks crystallized into perfect clarity. I smiled, which seemed to unnerve her slightly. "That's fine," I said, my voice pleasantly light. "I won't come to your wedding." Without another word, I walked upstairs to my home office. My hands didn't shake at all as I logged into my banking app and revoked Sarah's access to the wedding account. It took less than a minute, just a few clicks to end what had taken 12 years to build. Next, I called Robert, the wedding planner. He answered on the second ring. "Robert, this is Madeline Harrison. I need you to cancel all the wedding arrangements." Excuse me?" He sounded bewildered. "Is everything all right?" "No, it's not," I said honestly. "But it will be. Please cancel everything and process the refund to my account." The Grand Morrison was my next call. The events manager was apologetic but firm. They couldn't refund the deposit for the food and beverages that had already been ordered. It was a few $1,000s lost, but at that moment, it felt like money well spent. That evening, the house was silent. James was still sleeping in the living room. I could hear him shifting on the couch as I got ready for bed. As I lay there alone in the dark, I realized I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt free. The next morning, I took my time getting dressed. I chose my favorite blue silk blouse and pearl earrings, armor, for what I knew would be a difficult day. When I finally went downstairs for breakfast, the storm broke immediately. Sarah and James were already at the kitchen table, clearly waiting for me. The moment I appeared, Sarah leaped to her feet, her face red with fury. "What did you do?" she screamed. "How dare you cancel my wedding? How dare you block my access to the account? That money was for my wedding." I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hand steady. "I'm not going to sponsor a wedding I'm not invited to," I said simply, taking a sip. "You can't do this." Sarah's voice rose higher, tears starting to stream down her face. You've ruined everything. The venue, the flowers, the dress, it's all gone. I set my coffee cup down carefully. Actually, I can do this, and I did. Why don't you ask the people you actually want at your wedding to pay for it? Sarah's face crumpled. She let out a horrible, gasping sob and ran from the kitchen. Her footsteps thundered up the stairs, followed by the slam of her bedroom door. James stood up slowly, his face dark with anger. Fix this, he growled. Right now. Call everyone back, reopen the account, and arrange everything again. Or I'll file for divorce. The threat hung in the air between us. 12 years of marriage reduced to this moment. I looked at the man I'd loved, really looked at him, and wondered how I'd never seen this side of him before. Okay, I said calmly. File for divorce, I'm not against it. The color drained from his face. He clearly hadn't expected this response. Madeline, you can't be serious. I am, and since this is my house, I'd like you and Sarah to leave by tomorrow. His anger deflated like a punctured balloon. Look, he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory, I overreacted. We need to talk about this, think it through. I've already thought it through, I interrupted. I'm done living with people who don't appreciate or respect me. I'm done trying to buy love. The rest of the day passed in a blur of slammed doors and muffled arguments upstairs. At exactly 7 that evening, James and Sarah appeared in the foyer with their suitcases. Sarah's eyes were red and puffy from crying. I never thought you could be so cruel, she spat. I felt a laugh bubble up inside me, a genuine laugh of disbelief. Cruel? I paid for your clothes, your car, your education. I gave you a home, loved you like my own daughter, and was ready to spend $150,000 on your wedding. And you have the nerve to call me cruel, because I won't let you treat me like dirt. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, so much gentler than all the angry slams of the past few days. I stood in my foyer, and listened to the silence of my house. The house felt different after they left, lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted. I spent the first few days reorganizing spaces, reclaiming rooms that had slowly become filled with Sarah's things over the years. It was therapeutic, like cleaning out an old wound. Then came the message from Michael's mother. It popped up on my social media one evening while I was enjoying a glass of wine on my patio. I hope you realize what you've done, the message read. This wedding could fail entirely because of your actions. How can you be so heartless? I took my time responding, choosing my words carefully. I'm not heartless, I wrote back. I'm just done being disrespected. I won't pay for a wedding I'm not even invited to. If you're so concerned about the wedding's success, feel free to pay for it yourself. She read the message, but never replied. I imagined her sitting there, probably as shocked as James had been that I wouldn't back down. It's funny how people react when you finally stand up for yourself, like they can't quite believe you've stopped playing by their rules. I contacted my lawyer the next day. She'd helped me draft the prenup 12 years ago, and now she'd help me end the marriage it had protected. The divorce papers were ready within a week. When I called James to tell him they were ready, he tried his old tactics again. Maddie, please, he said, his voice soft and pleading, the voice that used to make my heart melt. We can start over, we can fix this. I hung up. He came to get the papers the next morning. He looked older somehow, tired. The competent man who'd threatened me with divorce was gone, replaced by someone who seemed lost. Sarah's been crying nonstop, he said, standing in my foyer, no longer our foyer. The wedding's going to be at City Hall now. No reception, no flowers, no fancy dress. Just a basic ceremony. I shrugged, remembering all the tears I'd shed over their betrayal. That's not my problem. How can you be so cold about this? It's not cold, James. It's just not my responsibility anymore. He took the papers and left. I watched him walk to his car, the car I'd bought him, and drive away. It felt final, but not sad. Just finished. The divorce was completed 2 months later. The prenup made everything simple. He couldn't touch my house, my business, or any of my assets. Sometimes I wondered if he'd ever really read that document, if he'd understood what it meant when he signed it 12 years ago. It didn't matter now. People ask me sometimes if I know how Sarah's wedding went. If she wore the dress she'd chosen, if Linda was there, if it was everything she'd dreamed of. I honestly don't know. I blocked them all on social media, changed my phone number, moved on with my life. What I do know is this: you can't buy love. Not real love, anyway. You can't purchase respect or gratitude or loyalty. I spent 12 years trying to build a family with my checkbook, and in the end, all it got me was a front row seat to watch that family choose someone else over me. But here's the thing about endings: they're also beginnings. My house is peaceful now. My business is thriving. And when I sit in my garden with my morning coffee, watching the sun rise over my flowers, I don't feel lonely. I feel free.
On our first wedding anniversary, everything fell apart. My mother-in-law stood up in front of everyone and accused me of stealing her luxury gold watch. My husband silenced the room, demanding I return it immediately. Furious, I shouted, "How dare you accuse me?" But before I could say more, he struck me hard across the face and called the police. I was dragged away in handcuffs while they laughed at my humiliation. But they never expected what happened next, because I came back the very next day with a surprise that turned their world upside down. My name is Sophia, and this is the story of how my life took a turn I could never have imagined. It all started 2 years ago when I married Ethan. I was 28, full of hope, and madly in love. Ethan, a 30-year-old banker, seemed like the perfect partner, kind, supportive, and driven. I had inherited a beautiful house from my parents, and the thought of starting a life together in that home felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. At first, everything seemed perfect. Ethan and I settled into the house, and for a while, it was just the two of us. Then came Margaret, Ethan's mother. Margaret, a wealthy socialite with a penchant for control, decided to move into the guest suite temporarily. She said it was to help us adjust to married life, but looking back, I realize it was her first step in asserting dominance over our lives. Margaret was not an easy woman to please. She had a way of making you feel small without ever raising her voice. At every turn, she criticized me, my cooking, my decorating, even the way I handled household finances. "Sophia," she'd say with a sharp tone, "you really think this shade of blue suits the living room? It's so juvenile." Ethan would laugh it off, telling me not to take her too seriously, but her words cut deep. I tried my best to keep the peace, thinking things would improve with time. But Margaret's presence only grew more oppressive. Every decision I made was questioned, and Ethan, to my dismay, rarely took my side. "She's just trying to help," he'd say, brushing off my concerns. I began to feel like an outsider in my own home. The first year of our marriage was a test of endurance. Every day felt like walking on eggshells around Margaret, who seemed to enjoy finding new ways to assert her control. Ethan's passive nature made things worse. He was so easily swayed by his mother that I often wondered if he even noticed how unhappy I was. But I loved him, and I held on, hoping things would change. Then came our first wedding anniversary, a day I had envisioned as a celebration of love and resilience. Ethan and I decided to host a grand party at our home. Margaret was, of course, heavily involved in the planning. "Leave it to me," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I wanted the day to be special, so I reluctantly let her take charge. The party was beautiful. Margaret spared no expense. Guests filled our home, laughing, dancing, and toasting to our 1-year milestone. I almost felt happy. Then everything changed. It started subtly. Margaret's icy smile became more pronounced as the evening went on. She mingled with the guests, her voice just loud enough for me to hear snippets of her conversations. "Sophia's lucky to have Ethan," she'd say, her tone dripping with condescension. I ignored it, reminding myself that this was our celebration, not hers. Then, during dinner, she stood up, tapping her glass to get everyone's attention. "I have something important to say," she announced, her voice commanding silence in the room. I glanced at Ethan, who looked as puzzled as I felt. Margaret held up her wrist, bare except for a faint tan line where a watch had once been. "My luxury watch, a family heirloom, is missing," she said, her gaze landing squarely on me. My heart sank. "It was here this morning, and now it's gone." The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and I felt their eyes on me. "Sophia," Margaret continued, her voice cold, "you were the last person near my room. Do you know anything about this?" I stared at her, stunned. "No," I stammered. "I don't know what you're talking about. I would never." "Don't lie," she snapped, her facade of politeness crumbling. "You've always been envious of our family's wealth. It's shameful." The room erupted in murmurs, and I felt like the walls were closing in. I turned to Ethan, desperate for support. "Ethan, you know I didn't do this." But he didn't defend me. Instead, he stood up, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Sophia," he said, his voice harsh, "if you took it, return it now. Don't make this worse." "I didn't take anything," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "How can you believe this?" Ethan's response was swift and shocking. In front of everyone, he struck me hard across the face. Gasps filled the room as I staggered backward, clutching my cheek. "Enough lies," he shouted. "I'll call the police." Before I could process what was happening, the police arrived. Ethan accused me of theft, and despite my protests, they handcuffed me and led me out of my own home. The last thing I saw before the doors closed behind me was Margaret's triumphant smirk and Ethan's cold, unforgiving eyes. As I sat in the police car, tears blurring my vision, one thought burned in my mind. This was not the life I had signed up for. I had been betrayed by the man I loved and humiliated in front of everyone. But deep inside, a spark of determination began to flicker. They had taken everything from me, my dignity, my home, my trust, but I wasn't going to let them win. This was only the beginning. The night I was taken away by the police felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The humiliation of being handcuffed in front of family, friends, and strangers still burned in my memory. Margaret's smirk and Ethan's indifference haunted me. Sitting in the cold interrogation room, I realized I was completely alone. The police officers questioned me for hours. They asked if I had stolen the watch, if I had any grudges against my mother-in-law, and where I had been that day. Over and over, I insisted on my innocence, but their skeptical looks told me they didn't believe me. They even searched my belongings, as if the watch would magically appear in my purse or pockets. Of course, they found nothing. The humiliation deepened. Eventually, they let me go due to lack of evidence, but the damage was already done. I walked out of the station in the early hours of the morning, dazed and shattered. I wanted to go home, but where was home now? My house, my inheritance, had been claimed by Ethan and Margaret, as if it had never belonged to me. I ended up at a small motel, feeling more lost than I ever had in my life. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My cheek was still red and swollen from Ethan's slap. The pain was a cruel reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. How had I ended up here? How had I let them do this to me? For the next few days, I drifted through life in a fog. Calls from friends and family flooded my phone, most of them gossiping about what had happened. Nobody offered real support, just curiosity wrapped in thin layers of concern. I didn't answer. What could I say? That my husband had turned on me, that I'd been framed, that I'd lost everything? I didn't want their pity. I needed a plan. Then, like a cruel joke, I received an eviction notice. Even though the house was legally mine, Ethan had manipulated the situation and transferred ownership to himself. He used our marriage as a weapon to take what my parents had left me. The notice was my breaking point. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was furious. They had humiliated me, stolen my home, and tried to paint me as a thief. But I wasn't going to let them win. Something inside me shifted that day. I wasn't going to be their victim. I was going to fight back. The first step was filing a police report against Ethan and Margaret. I walked into the same station where I had been interrogated and told the officers everything. I told them how Margaret had falsely accused me, how Ethan had struck me, and how they had fraudulently taken over my inheritance. The officers listened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. It was obvious they thought it was just a domestic squabble. But I wasn't going to let them dismiss me. "This isn't just about me," I said firmly. "It's about justice. They've stolen everything I have, and I can prove it." That's when I was introduced to Detective Laura Reed, a no-nonsense investigator who immediately took my case seriously. Laura was in her early 40s, sharp and methodical, with a calm demeanor that put me at ease. She promised to look into my claims, but warned me that it would take time to build a case.
"They sound clever," she said.
But clever people leave trails. Over the next few weeks, Laura and her team worked tirelessly. They combed through financial records, legal documents, and witness statements. I provided them with everything I had: emails, bank statements, even texts from Ethan that hinted at his plans to take control of the house. It was a slow and grueling process, but I felt a sense of purpose for the first time in weeks. During this time, I also began to regain my confidence. I found support in unexpected places, like the kind woman who ran the motel I was staying in. Her name was Maria, and she offered me warm meals and words of encouragement when I needed them most. "You're stronger than you think," she said one evening. "Don't let them take that away from you." One day, Laura called me with a breakthrough. "Sophia," she said, her voice tinged with excitement, "we've found something. Ethan and Margaret have been siphoning money from your accounts into a separate trust. They've been covering their tracks well, but we have enough evidence to proceed." Hearing those words felt like a lifeline. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope. Laura explained that they would need more time to build an airtight case, but I was finally starting to see the cracks in Ethan and Margaret's perfect facade. It wasn't just about the money or the house anymore. It was about reclaiming my life and standing up for myself. They had tried to destroy me, but I was still standing. And I wasn't going to stop until I saw them face justice. As the days turned into weeks, I prepared myself for what was to come. The case was getting stronger, but I knew Ethan and Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight.
I was ready for them.
For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. They had underestimated me, and soon, they would regret it. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about revenge. The weeks that followed were some of the most challenging of my life, but they were also filled with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. Detective Laura Reed and her team worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Every new piece of evidence they found felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming what had been stolen from me. Laura kept me updated regularly, and each time we met, she brought news that strengthened the case. One day, she sat across from me in her small, cluttered office and slid a folder across the desk. "Sophia, this is big," she said. "We've traced significant amounts of money being transferred from your personal accounts to an offshore account linked to Ethan." I opened the folder and saw the damning evidence laid out in black and white. Ethan had been systematically stealing from me, using our shared accounts to funnel my inheritance into his name. I felt a mix of anger and relief. It was painful to see how far he'd gone to betray me, but it was also proof that I wasn't imagining things. Laura leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying me. "We're also looking into Margaret's involvement. From what we've gathered, she's been orchestrating this from the start. She manipulated Ethan and used him to do her dirty work." Hearing that confirmed what I had always suspected. Margaret had never accepted me, and she had done everything in her power to tear me down. But now, the tables were starting to turn. As the investigation continued, I found myself reflecting on my marriage. How had I not seen this coming? How had I allowed Ethan and Margaret to take control of my life? The truth was, I had been so blinded by love that I ignored the red flags. Ethan's inability to stand up to his mother, Margaret's constant belittling, it was all there from the beginning. I just didn't want to see it. One evening, as I sat in my motel room, I received a call from Laura. "Sophia," she said, her voice serious, "we've found something else. Ethan and Margaret have been trying to sell the house. They've listed it under a fake name to avoid suspicion. My heart sank. The house wasn't just a building to me, it was the last piece of my parents' legacy. The thought of them profiting from it made my blood boil. "Can we stop them?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "Yes," Laura said firmly. "We've already filed an injunction to freeze the sale. They can't touch the property until this case is resolved." That was the moment I realized how important it was to keep fighting. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my parents' memory and ensuring that Ethan and Margaret didn't get away with their cruelty. The next major breakthrough came when Laura's team uncovered emails between Ethan and Margaret. In these emails, Margaret explicitly instructed Ethan on how to manipulate me into signing over the house. Her words were cold and calculating, with no regard for the damage they were causing. "You see, Sophia," Laura said as she showed me the emails, "this isn't just about fraud. It's about emotional abuse, too. They planned this from the start." I felt a surge of anger as I read Margaret's words. She had always presented herself as a sophisticated, well-mannered woman, but these emails revealed her true nature. She was a schemer, a manipulator, and a liar. And now, the world would see her for who she really was. The case finally went to court, and I was both nervous and determined. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I knew I had no choice. Ethan and Margaret were there, sitting smugly at the defendant's table. Margaret's cold gaze met mine, and I could see the disdain in her eyes. Ethan looked uneasy, but he avoided making eye contact with me. The trial was intense. Laura and her team presented the evidence meticulously, leaving no room for doubt. They showed the financial records, the forged documents, and the incriminating emails. Witnesses were called, including friends and acquaintances who testified about Margaret's manipulative behavior and Ethan's questionable actions. Sitting in that courtroom, I felt a mix of emotions. There were moments when I wanted to cry, moments when I wanted to scream, and moments when I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was my fight, and I was finally taking back control. One of the most powerful moments came when Laura cross-examined Margaret. "Mrs. Connors," she said, her voice calm but firm, "can you explain why you accused Sophia of stealing your watch when no evidence of theft was ever found?" Margaret faltered, her composed facade cracking. I believed she had taken it," she stammered. "Believed?" Laura pressed. "Or was it a convenient way to humiliate her and justify taking over her assets?" Margaret's silence spoke volumes. The courtroom was tense, and I could feel the eyes of the jury shifting toward her with judgment. By the time the trial concluded, I knew the tide had turned. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through their lies. The prosecutor gave a closing statement that left no room for doubt. Ethan and Margaret were guilty of fraud, theft, and emotional abuse. The judge delivered the verdict swiftly. Both Ethan and Margaret were found guilty and sentenced to prison. My assets, including the house, were to be returned to me immediately. As the verdict was announced, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I had won, but more than that, I had reclaimed my dignity. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a personal one. For the first time in a long time, I felt strong, empowered, and ready to start anew. The fight was over, but my journey was just beginning. As the courtroom emptied and the final echoes of the gavel faded, I sat still, letting the weight of everything settle. It was over. Ethan and Margaret were led away in handcuffs, their smugness replaced with disbelief and fear. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Laura approached me, a satisfied smile on her face. "You did it, Sophia," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "They got what they deserved." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady, but filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Leaving the courthouse that day, I realized how much had changed. I had started this journey broken and humiliated, but now I felt stronger than I ever thought possible. Justice had been served, and the pieces of my life were finally starting to come back together. underscore 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 underscore. The days that followed were filled with small victories. The house, my parents' legacy, was officially returned to me. Walking through its halls again was bittersweet. The memories of the betrayal that took place there were hard to ignore, but I was determined to reclaim it as my own. The first thing I did was redecorate, erasing every trace of Ethan and Margaret's presence. Each brushstroke of paint and every new piece of furniture felt like a step toward healing. Financially, I was back on stable ground. The court ordered the return of all the money Ethan had siphoned from my accounts. It wasn't just about the money, it was about restoring what was rightfully mine. With each account balance restored, I felt a little closer to reclaiming the independence I had lost. But the most important victory was emotional. For so long, I had let Ethan and Margaret's manipulation define me. Their betrayal had left scars, but now, those scars felt more like badges of resilience. I wasn't the same person I had been when I married Ethan, and that was a good thing. One afternoon, as I sat in my favorite armchair overlooking the garden, Laura called. "Sophia," she said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to check in. How are you doing?" "I'm good," I said, surprised at the truth of my own words. "Better than I thought I'd be." "I'm glad to hear that," she replied. "You've come a long way." We talked for a while, and as I hung up, I realized how grateful I was, not just for Laura's help, but for the journey that had brought me here. It hadn't been easy, but it had taught me more about myself than I ever thought possible. A few weeks later, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time: celebrate. I invited close friends and the few family members who had supported me through the ordeal to a small gathering at the house. It wasn't a grand party like the one Margaret had orchestrated. It was intimate and heartfelt, a celebration of new beginnings. As the evening progressed, I stood in the garden, watching my friends laugh and enjoy themselves. The air was warm, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the space. For the first time in a long time, I felt at home, not just in the house, but in my own life. Maria, the motel owner who had shown me so much kindness, approached me with a smile. "You look happy, Sophia," she said. "You deserve this." "I do, don't I?" I replied, surprising myself with my confidence. Months passed, and life began to feel normal again. I threw myself into work, taking on new clients and projects that reignited my passion for design. Slowly, I started to dream again, not of a life I had once planned with Ethan, but of a future that was entirely my own. One day, I came across a photo of myself and Ethan, taken during the early days of our relationship. I stared at it for a moment, expecting to feel anger or sadness. Instead, I felt nothing but a quiet resolve. That chapter of my life was over, and I had emerged stronger. Looking back now, I see that the betrayal I endured was a turning point, not just in my life, but in who I am. It taught me the value of resilience, the importance of fighting for what's right, and the strength that comes from standing up for yourself. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it led me to a place of self-discovery and empowerment. I'm no longer the woman who let others control her life. I'm Sophia, a woman who fought back, reclaimed her dignity, and built a new life on her own terms. And for that, I am proud. This is my story, and it's only the beginning.
This story is titled, "Parents Raised My Rent to Support, Deadbeat Sister Boyfriend." So I left and now they are begging me for help. Hey, first-time poster here. I'm Alex, 23 male, and things have been pretty chaotic in my life recently. I don't usually share personal stuff like this, but I need to vent and hear your opinion. I'm currently in college and grinding my way through life with a full-ride scholarship and 2 part-time jobs. I live at home with my parents, which sounds great on paper because it's rent-free, but trust me, it's not as easy as it sounds. See, I've got a sister, Kara, who's 25 female and the certified golden child of the family. And when I say golden child, I mean she can screw up royally, and my parents will find a way to spin it like she's the second coming of Christ. Let me paint you a picture. Growing up, Kara could do no wrong. If she brought home a C on her report card, my parents would celebrate it like she'd won a Nobel Prize. She tried her best, they'd say. Meanwhile, if I got a B instead of an A, it was, "What happened, Alex? You're smarter than this." Kara was the type who barely lifted a finger at home. Chores? Not her thing. If she didn't do the dishes, my parents would shrug it off, saying, "Oh, Kara must have been so busy with her friends." But if I forgot to take out the trash, it was a whole lecture about how I needed to be more responsible. It doesn't stop there. Kara had this ex-boyfriend, Greg, who was the absolute worst. He was manipulative, controlling, and quite frankly, a user. Greg had Kara wrapped around his finger, and she couldn't see it. He would borrow money from her constantly, guilt-tripping her about how he needed help to get back on his feet. Guess what? He never did. Kara worked a decent job for a while, but every dime seemed to end up funding Greg's shady ventures, like his failed music career and random trips with his buddies. What's worse is that when I tried to point out Greg's obvious manipulation, I was told to stay out of it because I didn't understand their connection. My parents? They weren't much help. They'd brush it off with, "Kara's a grown woman. Let her make her own choices." Which, fine, fair enough. But when Greg eventually dumped her and left her in financial ruin, guess who my parents leaned on to pick up the pieces? Me. Now don't get me wrong, I didn't hate Kara growing up. She wasn't mean to me or anything. But the favoritism was hard to ignore, especially as we got older. While I was busting my ass in school, Kara was coasting through life. She barely passed high school, didn't bother with college, and started working at random retail jobs that never lasted more than a few months. My parents, of course, always had excuses for her. "She's just figuring herself out," they'd say. When I got my scholarship and started college, I thought maybe things would finally shift. I mean, I was doing everything right, getting good grades, working hard, planning for my future. But nope, Kara was still the star of the show. When she got a job at a boutique last year, my parents acted like she'd been elected to Congress. "She's working so hard," they gushed. Never mind that the boutique barely pays her minimum wage, and she spends half her paycheck on clothes she doesn't need. When Kara finally moved out into her own apartment, I was relieved. I thought, finally, some peace and quiet. But that didn't last long. It started with little comments from my mom. "Kara's having a hard time with her rent," my mom said one evening while we were watching TV. She sounded hesitant, like there was more she wasn't saying. I just nodded, figuring it wasn't my problem. "She's trying so hard, but things are just so expensive," my mom added. "Yeah, I guess," I said, not really paying attention. Then, a few weeks later, the real conversation happened. My parents sat me down at the dining table like we were about to discuss some life or death situation. "Alex, we've been talking," my dad started. "Uh-oh," I said, half joking but already feeling a sense of dread. My mom jumped in. "You're doing so well in school and we're so proud of you. You've got that scholarship, you're working hard. You're really setting yourself up for success." "Thanks," I said, still unsure where this was going. "Well, Kara's struggling right now," she continued. "Her rent is really high, and her job just doesn't pay enough to cover everything." I frowned. "Okay, and?" "We were thinking," my dad said, "since you're saving so much with your scholarship and you're living here rent-free, maybe you could help her out a little, just for a few months until she gets back on her feet." I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. "You want me to pay Kara's rent?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. "She's your sister," my mom said, as if that explained everything. "She's an adult," I replied. "Shouldn't she figure it out herself?" "She's trying, Alex," my dad said, his tone turning stern. "Not everyone has the same opportunities you've had. You're in a position to help, and it's only fair." "Fair?" I shot back. "How is it fair that I'm working 2 jobs and going to school full-time, and now I have to pay for Kara too?" "You're being selfish," my mom said, shaking her head like I'd just kicked a puppy. "If the situation were reversed, Kara would help you." I seriously doubted that. We argued for what felt like hours. I told them it wasn't my responsibility, that I was already stretched thin, and that Kara needed to learn how to manage her own life. But my parents wouldn't budge. "She's your family," my mom snapped. "You'd let her drown while you swim?" "She's getting a raise soon," my dad added. "It's just 3 months. She'll pay you back." At that moment, I told them I will think about it and went to my room questioning myself. How much am I supposed to give? 3 months might turn into 6, then a year. If Kara keeps struggling or spending, will I be expected to keep bailing her out? What I'm really trying to figure out is if I'm wrong for feeling this way. Should I just bite the bullet, pay her rent, and avoid any drama? Or do I have a right to feel like this whole situation is unfair? I've always been the one to keep the peace in the family, but this is pushing me to my breaking point. I'm tired of always being the one to sacrifice while Kara gets a free ride. And that's where I'm stuck. Do I stand my ground and risk blowing things up with my family? Or do I keep quiet and let the resentment keep building? If anyone's been through something like this, I'd really appreciate hearing how you dealt with it. When I make my decision, I'll post here. Stay tuned. Update 1 point. Okay, guys, it's your butt, Alex. So, eventually, I caved. My parents didn't exactly leave me much of a choice. They kept piling on the guilt, saying things like, Kara would do the same for you, or, you're in a position to help, Alex. It's what family does. So, yeah, I agreed. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument, and maybe helping her out would keep the peace. But now, sitting here and looking at the bigger picture, I'm starting to feel like I've been set up. From the moment I started sending her money, Kara acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. Not a single thank you, no acknowledgement that I was making sacrifices to help her out. Instead, she kept doing what she always does, posting Instagram stories of her latest shopping hauls, brunch outings, and fancy coffee drinks that cost more than my daily lunch budget. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself, maybe she's using her own money for that stuff. Maybe she's cutting back in other areas. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to believe. Last week was the tipping point. Kara posted a story of herself at a spa with the caption, Self-Care Weekend. Self-care? I'm working 2 jobs and covering her rent, and she's taking spa weekends? That's when I decided to ask my mom about it. So, Kara's rent is all covered now, right? I asked, trying to sound casual. Yes, thank you for helping her, my mom said, clearly pleased with herself for orchestrating this. Cool, just wondering. Does she, need more help? I asked. What do you mean? Well, I said, choosing my words carefully, she doesn't seem very stressed. I mean, she's been shopping and going to spas. Doesn't really look like someone who's struggling. My mom gave me a look like I'd just insulted the Pope. Alex, she's allowed to enjoy herself. Just because she's having a hard time doesn't mean she can't take a break every now and then. Sure, but how is she affording all this? I pressed. She's using her own money for that. You don't have to micromanage her life. Micromanage? I'm the one paying her rent, and I don't get to ask questions? I let it go, but the frustration was bubbling over. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't adding up. Kara was supposed to be broke. I kept checking her social media. Her Instagram captions were vague, almost like she didn't want anyone to ask too many questions. Living my best life, one post read. It didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I wasn't trying to control Kara's life. I just wanted to understand how this situation made sense. But whenever I asked about her struggles, she'd dodge the question or change the subject. It's just complicated, she'd say, which only made me more suspicious. But I could see I wasn't going to get anywhere with Mom, so I dropped it. That conversation planted a seed of doubt in my mind that only grew stronger with time. I started paying closer attention, looking for anything that might explain how Kara was living so comfortably despite her supposed financial struggles. One evening, I was at my parents' house again when I overheard Kara on the phone. She was in her old bedroom, talking in a hushed voice. No, I told you, I'll send it tomorrow, she said. Just stop freaking out, okay? I froze. Who was she sending money to? Wasn't I the one covering her rent? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I remembered something my cousin Matt had mentioned a few weeks earlier. Did you know Kara's been hanging out with Greg again? Matt said casually during a family barbecue, leaning against the counter. I frowned. Greg? Her ex? Why? Matt shrugged. Dunno. Saw them at that coffee shop by her place. Looked cozy. He paused, then added, You ever notice Kara's been acting weird? Weird how? I asked, narrowing my eyes. I don't know, he said, taking a sip of his drink. She's been way more private than usual. Like she's hiding something big. I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. What could Kara possibly be hiding? Greg was supposed to be ancient history, a deadbeat who'd mooched off Kara for years before she finally dumped him. Or so I thought. The way Matt mentioned him, almost like it wasn't over, gnawed at me. I ignored it then, but now I wish I'd paid attention. I decided I needed to dig deeper. That night, I went home and opened up Venmo, searching for Kara's account. I felt a little guilty snooping, but I justified it by telling myself I had a right to know where my money was going. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were multiple consistent payments to Greg. The captions were vague. For groceries. You owe me one. Thanks again. I stared at the phone screen, trying to realize my money wasn't going to Kara's rent, it was going to her ex. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was, working overtime and cutting back on everything just to help her, and she was using it to support someone who'd already taken advantage of her once. I spent the rest of the night stewing in anger and disbelief. I don't know whether to confront her immediately, or should I calm down and think it through. This isn't about the money anymore. It is about the lies. I actually have a lot of questions to Kara, and most probably will confront her. I'll keep you updated. Update 2: Hey, Alex here again. Things blew up way more than I expected. I wasn't planning on making a huge scene, but when you get pushed to your limit, it just happens. A quick side note, my cousin Matt, the guy who knows everyone's business, is the only person in my corner right now. He's been hearing me vent about all of this, and even warned me about Kara hanging out with Greg again. He convinced me to confront her, saying, if you don't handle it, she'll keep walking all over you. She's used to you keeping quiet. So, armed with frustration and Matt's encouragement, I decided to talk to Kara face to face. That weekend, Matt came with me to Kara's apartment. I needed backup, someone who could keep me grounded if things went sideways. When we got there, her car was parked outside, so I knew she was home. Matt gave me a nod, and I knocked on her door. Kara opened it, looking surprised, and not in a good way. Her eyes darted between me and Matt, her body stiff. What are you guys doing here? She asked, leaning against the doorframe. We need to talk, I said. She sighed, glancing back into her apartment. Now's not a good time, Alex. Too bad, I said, stepping inside before she could stop me. Matt followed, closing the door behind him. Her apartment was tidy, but the tension in the air was thick. Kara crossed her arms, her expression guarded. What's this about? I wasted no time. Greg, her face paled. What about him? I know you've been giving him money, I said, my voice calm but firm. The money I've been sending you for rent. I've seen the payments, Kara. Don't lie to me. Matt stood by the door, arms crossed, giving her a look that said, don't even try to weasel out of this. Kara's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then she scoffed. Wow, Alex, snooping through my Venmo? Classy. Don't deflect, Matt cut in. Just answer the question. She glared at him before turning back to me. Fine. Yes, I've been helping Greg. He's in a tough spot, okay? A tough spot? I said, my voice rising. Kara, are you kidding me? Greg is the reason you were broke in the first place. And now you're taking my money to bail him out? You don't get it, she snapped. I didn't want to tell you because I knew you'd freak out like this. Of course I'm freaking out, I shouted. I've been working 2 jobs to help you, and you've been lying to me this whole time. Lying? I didn't lie, she said defensively. I just didn't tell you. That's the same thing, I said. Do Mom and Dad know about this? She froze, her face flushing. Number, and they don't need to. Oh, they're going to, I said, turning toward the door. Alex, wait, she said, panic creeping into her voice. No, I said firmly. I've had enough of this. Matt and I drove straight to my parents' house. On the way, he kept saying, you're doing the right thing. They need to know the truth. Kara can't keep playing the victim. When we got there, my parents were in the living room watching TV. I walked in, not even bothering to sit down. We need to talk, I said. My mom muted the TV, looking concerned. What's going on? It's about Kara, I said, my voice steady. She's been lying to all of us. She's not struggling to pay her rent. She's been giving money to Greg. My dad's eyebrows shot up. Greg? Her ex? Yes, I said. The same guy who used her for years. She's been taking the money I've been giving her and funneling it to him. My mom's face tightened, and for a moment, I thought they were going to be angry at Kara. But then she sighed and said, Alex, I think you're overreacting. I blinked. What? She's been lying to us. She's trying to help someone she cares about, my mom said. You don't know what Greg's going through. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What Greg's going through? What about what I'm going through? I've been working nonstop to help Kara because you guilted me into it, and now you're defending her? Alex, calm down, my dad said, his tone firm. Kara's your sister. Family helps family. Are you serious? I said, my voice breaking. You're really going to side with her after everything she's done? She's not perfect, my mom said, but she's doing her best. No, she's not, I said, my anger boiling over. She's been lying, manipulating, and taking advantage of me. And you're letting her get away with it. Enough, Alex, my dad said, his voice sharp. This conversation is over. I looked at them, my chest heaving with frustration, and realized something I'd been avoiding for years. They were never going to hold Kara accountable. Fine, I said, grabbing my keys. If you won't do anything about it, I will. I stormed out, Matt close behind me. When we got to the car, he turned to me and said, "Well, that went about as expected." "Yeah," I said bitterly. "They'll never change." After a few days, the pounding on the door pulled me away from the sink where I was rinsing out a coffee mug. It was late. My parents were sleeping, and I wasn't expecting anyone, so the sound alone was enough to put me on edge. When I opened the door, Greg stood there, looking like hell. Unkempt, swaying slightly, and reeking of sweat. "What the hell do you want?" I asked, gripping the edge of the door. Greg pushed past me without answering, brushing crumbs off the arm of the couch before dropping onto it like he owned the place. He tilted his head back and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, as if he'd just come from some great battle. "Kara's not answering her damn phone," he said finally, glaring up at the ceiling. "Yeah, she doesn't live here," I snapped, closing the door harder than necessary. "Why are you here?" Greg ignored my question. "She thinks she can just cut me off like that. Keep my kid away from me." "Nah, not happening." I froze mid-step, my pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" He tilted his head toward me, a crooked grin spreading across his face. "Come on, Alex. Don't play dumb. You know." I didn't respond. Greg sat up straighter, his grin widening, when he realized I genuinely had no idea what he was talking about. "She didn't tell you, huh?" he said, almost gleeful. "Of course she didn't. Wouldn't want to ruin her perfect little story." "Tell me what?" I demanded, my voice sharp. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your dear sister," he said, dragging out the words, "has a kid. My kid. 2 years old." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him. He leaned back against the couch, watching me like he was waiting for the explosion. "You're lying," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. Greg barked out a laugh. "Yeah, that's what she'd love you to think. But no, man. It's the truth. She's been paying me to keep it quiet. Doesn't want the world to know she's not as perfect as mommy and daddy like to think." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Kara had a child, and she'd kept it a secret from everyone, including me. Greg rubbed his face and sighed again, this time with exaggerated frustration. "I mean, she's got you footing the bills, doesn't she? Living the high life while keeping me out of my own kid's life. It's bullshit, man." His words hung in the air, thick and heavy. My stomach churned as the pieces started to fit together. Her defensiveness. Whenever I asked about her finances, her response was always the same. "It's complicated." She'd snap if I pressed her, her face turning red as she muttered, "You wouldn't understand." Back then, I thought she was just embarrassed. Now I wonder if she was hiding something bigger. But now I know better. The money going to Greg, the Instagram posts of brunches and shopping trips. "She's sending you my money," I said, more a statement than a question. Greg shrugged, smirking. "Guess you're not as clueless as I thought." The rage bubbled up before I could stop it. I stepped closer, my fists clenched. "Get out!" I growled. Greg stood slowly, holding up his hands in mock surrender. Fine. I'm leaving. But you tell Kara she doesn't get to rewrite history. This isn't over." I opened the door and stood there, glaring at him until he stumbled out into the night. The silence in the house felt suffocating after he left. I sat on the edge of the couch, my mind racing. Kara had a child. She'd lied to everyone about it, not because she was scared or ashamed, but because it was inconvenient for her. According to her Instagram, she was living her best life, keeping her mess secrets while taking money from me and using it to keep Greg quiet. This wasn't the behavior of someone struggling to get by. Kara wasn't struggling. She was coasting, using everyone around her to maintain her cushy lifestyle. And worst of all, she dragged me to her own shit. The next morning, I couldn't sit still. The anger simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. I called Matt, the only person I knew who wouldn't sugarcoat things. "Greg showed up at the house last night," I said as soon as he picked up. "Why?" Matt asked, his tone already skeptical. "He was drunk, ranting about Kara, about their kid." There was a pause. "Their what?" "She has a kid," I said bitterly. 2 years old. She's been paying Greg to keep it a secret." Matt let out a low whistle. "Man, that's messed up. And your parents don't know?" "Of course not," I said. "If they did, they'd probably still find a way to defend her." "Oh, she's doing her best," I mocked bitterly. Matt didn't laugh. "You're right, though. They'll defend her no matter what. But Alex, this isn't something you can let slide. She's been using you. That's not just shitty. It's cruel. I know, I said, and I'm done. Good, Matt said firmly. So what's the plan? I didn't answer right away. My mind was already spinning, calculating my next move. Kara had spent her entire life getting away with everything because people like me let her. That was about to change. She thinks she can keep walking all over me, I said finally. But she's about to learn how wrong she is. And I meant it. This wasn't about making peace or keeping the family together anymore. It was about making sure Kara faced the consequences of the life she'd built on lies and manipulation. For once, she wasn't going to walk away unscathed. I've got something clever in mind, just to make sure they think twice before messing with me again. Wait for my next update if you're interested. Update 3.0. Hey people, it's Alex again, and I'm here to spill the tea. Well, as I was planning my next move, the eviction notice landed like a thunderclap. I hadn't meant to open it. It had been addressed to Kara but delivered to my parents' house. I found it sitting on the counter, the envelope already half torn. Would I miss this opportunity to know more about Kara's mess? Hell nah. I slid the letter out. My eyes scanned the lines. Months of unpaid rent, complaints from the landlord, and the inevitable conclusion. Kara was being kicked out. I placed the letter back on the counter, a mix of anger and grim satisfaction simmering under the surface. This was her mess. She'd made it. But I knew how this would play out. Kara would spin this, and my parents, as always, would rush to cushion her fall. When Kara arrived that evening, her bag slung over her shoulder, she moved through the house with her usual air of indifference. She barely greeted me as she dropped her things on the kitchen counter and helped herself to a cup of coffee. The eviction notice was still where I'd left it, its presence screaming in the silence of the room. I waited. She saw the envelope, paused, and then, without hesitation, ripped it open. Her eyes flicked over the letter, and her face barely changed. She let out a frustrated sigh, tossed the paper onto the counter, and grabbed her cup as if nothing had happened. It was her usual tactic. Ignore the storm until someone else cleaned it up. My parents came in shortly after, their voices cheerful until they saw Kara's expression. My mom picked up the letter, her hand trembling slightly as she read it. My dad hovered over her shoulder, his face tightening as he absorbed the words. They didn't say much. My mom placed a hand on Kara's arm, murmuring something comforting, while my dad stared at the letter with a clenched jaw. The energy in the room shifted as they quickly fell into their usual roles. Kara the victim, my parents the saviors. I stood in the corner, watching the whole charade play out, my fists clenching at my sides. Within days, Kara's bags were back in her old room. The move was seamless, orchestrated by my parents with a quiet efficiency that made my stomach churn. They didn't even mention the eviction to me, like it was some unspoken agreement that I didn't need to know. But the truth had already started to unravel. The final piece came when I overheard my parents talking in hushed voices late one night. The words "child" and "Greg" cut through the walls like a knife. My stomach dropped as I realized they knew. They'd known all along. About the child. About Greg. About everything. And they hadn't told me. They only used me. The next morning, I made my move. Quietly, carefully, I gathered every piece of evidence I had. Venmo transactions, screenshots of Kara's Instagram, showing her frivolous lifestyle, notes on every excuse she'd ever given me. And then I made a call to her landlord. The woman on the other end was polite but firm, clearly frustrated with Kara's antics. She listened carefully as I explained what I knew, that Kara had been funneling money elsewhere while ignoring her rent. The landlord thanked me, her tone shifting as she realized the depth of Kara's deception. Kara's landlord wasted no time filing a formal complaint, tightening the screws on the eviction process. Kara's reaction was predictable, storming around the house, slamming doors, muttering about how unfair it all was. My parents rallied around her, offering comfort and excuses, their focus solely on Kara while ignoring the chaos she'd left behind. I stayed out of their way, my silence a pointed reminder that I wasn't playing along this time. When my mom finally cornered me, asking for help to get Kara back on her feet, I just shook my head and walked away. The last time I saw Kara, she was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. My parents hovered nearby, discussing plans to help her find a new apartment, offering to cover her expenses until she got back on track. I packed my things that day, leaving the house with a clear conscience. Let them deal with the fallout. Let Kara learn what happens when her lies finally catch up to her. For the first time, I felt no guilt as I walked away. She'd burned every bridge, and I wasn't about to rebuild them for her. This time, she was on her own. I don't know what the future holds. I will probably post for you one final update to let you know if things settle or worsen. Final update. Dot. Hey, it's Alex again. I figured I owed you all one last update since things have finally settled. It went exactly how I expected. After the eviction notice and everything that followed, Kara moved back in with my parents. They acted like it was some heroic act of selflessness, even though it was the most predictable outcome ever. My mom and dad immediately fell into damage control mode, bending over backward to make sure their golden child was comfortable. They cleaned out her old room, stocked the fridge with all her favorites, and even took time off work to help her adjust. Meanwhile, Kara acted like she was doing them a favor by being there. Not once did she acknowledge the mess she'd made, or the lies that got her there. As for Greg, he kept up his nonsense. Apparently, he's been threatening legal action for custody of the child, but Kara's handling it the same way she handles everything, with avoidance and denial. My parents, of course, believe every word she says about how Greg's just trying to make her life miserable. Funny how they never stop to ask why she kept any of this a secret in the first place. My parents did try to drag me back into it, though. My mom called me a week after Kara moved in, her voice full of forced optimism. "We're all pulling together to help Kara," she said, like it was some noble crusade. "We could really use your support, Alex." "Support?" I said, trying not to laugh. "You mean money?" There was a long pause before she admitted it. "She just needs a little help getting back on her feet." "You're doing so well, Alex. And it's what family does." "Family?" I said. "You mean the family she lied to? The family she manipulated for years while spending my money on Greg and God knows what else?" "Alex, she's your sister," my mom said, her voice taking on that disappointed tone she always uses when she doesn't get her way. "She's trying." "No, Mom," I said firmly. "She's not, and I'm not bailing her out again." I hung up before she could guilt me further. Now, weeks later, I've stepped back completely. I haven't been to the house, haven't answered their calls, haven't engaged in their drama. Kara's still living there, still letting my parents handle her problems while she does the bare minimum to stay afloat. The difference is, I'm no longer part of it. For the first time in years, I feel free. No more guilt, no more enabling, no more being dragged into messes I didn't create. I'm focusing on myself, my school, my jobs, my future. I don't know if Kara will ever change. Honestly, I doubt it. My parents will probably keep enabling her until she's 40, and still blaming everyone else for her problems. But that's not my problem anymore. Thanks for sticking with me through this mess. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is walk away, even if it's from family. Take care, everyone. Alex.
Of 2 daughters, I am the oldest and go by Barbara. I've always been the serious one, the independent one, from as long back as I can remember. Michelle, my sister, was precisely the reverse. Our house was always noisy growing up. Michelle's laughter, Mom and Dad's loving attention on her, and the continual buzz of pop tunes running in the background. Me, I liked peaceful areas, my nose buried in a book or focusing on homework. Birthdays and holidays always made it very evident how different Michelle and I were. She would tear through her presents, squealing with delight over the newest devices or fashion-forward clothing. I, on the other hand, meticulously saved any money I got. "What are you saving for Ratch this time?" Dad would inquire, a trace of pride in his voice, but his eyes revealed he lacked total understanding. "A laptop for learning," I said. "The library computers are often crowded." He nodded, but I could see they didn't understand why I didn't desire what other girls my age did. Michelle was a swirl of fresh ideas and constant pressure. "Mom, did you check out the latest iPhone? Every student at the institution carries it. I need it," she would say. She would also receive it. No questions, no saving. I recall the day I at last paid for my laptop. Months of savings had gone on investigating the ideal model. I felt quite proud when I got it home. "Look, at last I understand," I declared at dinner. Mom turned her head from her dish. "That's great, sweetheart. Oh, Michelle, tell us about your mall day." And the topic changed exactly like that. Michelle descended into a protracted narrative about her shopping trip, and my success vanished from view. It was not that they did not love me. I knew they did in their own unique manner. But Michelle was the sun in our family's solar system, and I was a far-off planet gently revolving on my own path. The variations between us just grew as we grew older. Michelle followed the most current fashion trends and experimented with wild hair. I stayed with my comfy trousers and sensible ponytail. The library became my quiet haven where I could concentrate on my objectives, free from any interruptions. When it came time for college, I gave all I had on applications. I stayed late many nights honing essays, investigating scholarships, and preparing for admission tests. One of the finest times of my life came when I received my acceptance letter bearing a full scholarship. Running into the kitchen, I waved the letter. "Dad, Mom, I entered under a full scholarship." Mom turned to help Michelle with her makeup. "That's lovely, sweetheart. Hold steady, Michelle. I'm trying to get your eyeliner exactly correct." Dad turned to check his newspaper. "Good work, Barbara." Nothing less was what we expected. Their lack of enthusiasm wounded, but I was used to it. I returned to my room clutching the letter. This was my opportunity to at last escape, to prove myself. Michelle hardly made it through high school in meantime. The day Sarah handed her failing report card, I considered our parents might at last be let down. Rather, though, they encircled her with encouragement. Mom, patting her hair, whispered, "Oh, sweetie, don't worry. Everyone does not find college to be ideal. You are quite gifted in many other areas." Dad nodded. "That's right, Princess. You will figure out your road." It still astounds me. "Are you sincere?" She almost made it. I blurted forward. Mom fixed me a stern glance. "Barbara, try not to be nasty. Your sister is endowed with various gifts." I bit my tongue, then turned to go. Michelle would always be their favorite, no matter what I accomplished. Attaching college was a fresh beginning. I was surrounded for the first time by people that valued diligence and drive. Resolved to maximize this opportunity, I immersed myself into my studies. In my second year, one day I got a call from home. It was Michelle, her voice as usual lively. "Ratch, guess what? I consider enrolling in some classes on beauty. Mom and Dad find that to be a fantastic idea." Though I knew she wouldn't care, I wanted to tell her about the research project I was working on or the summer internship I had landed. After hanging up, I felt both frustrated and motivated. I was on my own path, and I was going to make it count. Years passed quickly. While Michelle jumped from one beauty course to the next without finishing anything, I graduated with honors. I got a job at a top company even before my diploma was dry. Moving into my own apartment was a bittersweet moment. As I unpacked my few belongings, I thought about how different my life was from Michelle's. She was still at home, pampered by our parents, while I was standing on my own, ready to take on the world. The first few months at my job were a blur. I worked longer hours than anyone else, determined to prove myself. Within a year of hard work, I was promoted to team leader. Excited, I called home to share the news. Mom picked up the phone. "Oh, Barbara, that's nice, but guess what? Michelle met the most wonderful boy. He comes from such a good family. We're all so thrilled." As she went on about Michelle's new boyfriend, my promotion seemed to disappear into the background. I hung up, feeling deflated, but it only made me more determined. If my family couldn't value my achievements, I'd just have to achieve even more. I threw myself into my work with everything I had. Days turned into nights and weekends became extra opportunities to get ahead. My hard work paid off. One promotion led to another, and before long, I became the youngest department head in the company's history. One day, Mr. Paul, the company owner, called me into his office. "Barbara, your work has been outstanding. We've never had someone rise through the ranks so quickly," he said with a smile. "Thank you, sir. I love what I do," I replied, beaming with pride. "And it shows," he said. "That's why I want to offer you something special. We have a program for top employees, a chance to buy an apartment at a significant discount. You've earned it." The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and planning. When I finally got the keys to my new apartment, I felt like I was floating. I decided to host a housewarming party to celebrate with the people who mattered most. Since I didn't have much furniture yet, I bought some inexpensive plastic tables and chairs and set everything up with care. Even the disposable tableware matched the decor. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. On the day of the party, my colleagues arrived first, bringing thoughtful gifts and warm congratulations. Then my family showed up. Mom, Dad, and Michelle came in like a whirlwind. Michelle's eyes darted around the room, taking in the modest furnishings. I caught the smirk she tried to hide. As the evening went on, I noticed a pattern. Every time one of my colleagues congratulated me or brought up my accomplishments, my parents would quickly change the subject to Michelle. "Oh, that reminds me," Mom said, cutting off one of my coworkers mid-sentence. "Did Barbara tell you about Michelle's latest modeling gig? She's just so photogenic." Dad chimed in. "Yes, our Mel was born for the spotlight. Such natural talent." I saw the confused and slightly uncomfortable looks on my colleagues' faces as the focus shifted from my achievements to Michelle once again. I wanted to disappear into the floor. Michelle, on the other hand, soaked up the attention. "Oh, Mom, stop it," she'd say with a giggle, clearly enjoying every second. Finally, thankfully, my family left. The moment the door closed, my coworker Laura turned to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Barbara, what the hell was that?" she asked, her voice low and concerned. I shrugged, trying to brush it off. "Oh, that's just how they are." Another colleague, David, shook his head. "No, Barbara, that's not normal. Are you okay? Do you need help?" A lump formed in my throat. Their concern was touching, but also embarrassing. "Guys, really, it's fine. I'm used to it," I said, forcing a smile. "Who wants another drink?" As I busied myself in the kitchen, I could hear them whispering, their worry obvious. I blinked back tears, refusing to let them see how much my family's behavior had hurt me. After that disastrous housewarming, I buried myself in work again, determined to move forward. The months flew by, and slowly I turned my apartment into a home I could truly be proud of. Every piece of furniture, every splash of color on the walls was a reminder of my hard work and independence. One sunny Monday, I decided to treat myself to something I'd been saving for, a car. It wasn't flashy, just a reliable Sedan to get me where I needed to go. As I drove it home, a wave of pride washed over me. This car was mine, bought with my own money, a symbol of everything I had accomplished. I hadn't planned to tell my family, but news spread fast. That evening, my phone rang, and Michelle's cheerful voice came through the speaker. "Ratch, I heard you bought a car. That's nice," she said, though her tone made it clear she didn't mean it. "You're really doing things the hard way. All this working and saving. It's so unnecessary." Her words made my stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well," she said, as if explaining something obvious, "the main job of a woman is to marry properly. Find a man who will take care of you and give you everything you need. Why work yourself to death when you could have it all handed to you?" I was speechless for a moment. "Michelle, that's not how I see things. I want to earn what I have. I'm proud of what I've accomplished." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. "Oh, Ratch, always the difficult one. Well, you'll see. I'll show you how it's done." Before I could respond, Michelle had hung up. I stared at the phone, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. How could we see life so differently? A few months later, I got my answer. Michelle called, her voice full of excitement. "Barbara, you'll never guess. I'm getting married. His name is Nicholas, and he's absolutely loaded. His parents are paying for everything. The wedding's going to be stunning." As she went on about the dresses, flowers, and guest list, I felt an emptiness inside me. This was what she had been working toward, her idea of success. The wedding day came faster than I expected. I stood in a grand hall, surrounded by glittering guests, feeling out of place. Michelle looked radiant in her designer gown, and our parents couldn't stop beaming with pride. I sipped champagne, trying to swallow the bitterness building inside me. Had my parents ever looked at me with such pride? Had they ever been this happy about anything I'd achieved? As the night went on, I felt more and more like a stranger. Michelle thrived in the spotlight, charming the guests and soaking up the attention. Our parents introduced themselves to everyone, proudly announcing, "We're the parents of the bride." On my way home, driving my modest car back to my modest apartment, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made the wrong choices. Was Michelle right? Had I chosen the harder path for nothing? But then I thought about my job, my achievements, and the pride I felt knowing I had earned everything on my own. No, I decided. My path might be harder, but it was mine. That made all the difference. After Michelle's wedding, life settled into a routine. Work kept me busy, but my mother's calls became irregular and unwelcome, interruption. Every conversation followed the same pattern. "Barbara, darling," Mom would start, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You won't believe what Michelle's been up to." I'd brace myself as she launched into another story about Michelle's fabulous life. She's been invited to the most exclusive events. Can you believe it? Our Michelle rubbing elbows with high society. One day, after an especially exhausting call, I couldn't hold back any more. "Mom, that's great for Michelle," I said, frustration leaking into my voice. "But don't you want to know what's going on in my life?" There was a pause. Then Mom said in a patronizing tone, "Oh, honey, of course we care, but you really should learn from your sister. Be more glamorous. Why work so hard for so little when you could have it all?" A few weeks later, I received an invitation. Michelle and Nicholas were throwing a housewarming party for their new luxury apartment, a gift from his parents, naturally. The night of the party, I stood outside Michelle and Nicholas's building, feeling small. I smoothed down my simple dress, took a deep breath, and walked in. The apartment was breathtaking. Every surface sparkled, and every piece of furniture looked like it cost more than I made in a year. My parents were already there, marveling at every detail. Tried to stay in the background, but Michelle spotted me almost immediately. She walked over, holding a champagne flute, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. "Barbara, so glad you could make it," she said, her tone sweet but her gaze critical. "I hope you're taking notes. This is how a housewarming should be done. None of that plastic furniture and disposable dishes nonsense like at your place." My cheeks burned. "Michelle, that's—" But she didn't wait to hear the rest, already flitting off to dazzle other guests, leaving me standing there with the sting of her words. In the weeks that followed, Michelle seemed determined to flaunt her lifestyle at every turn. She bought the most expensive things, clothes, jewelry, you name it. Then came the car. One evening after work, a sleek sports car pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and there was Michelle, her face smug. "Like it," she purred. "Just a little gift from Nicholas. Thought I'd take it for a spin." I glanced at my plain but dependable sedan. "It's very nice, Michelle." She followed my gaze and laughed. "Oh, Barbara, always settling for less. You'll always be working for others while I live the good life." Her words stung, but I didn't let her see it. 3 years passed in a blur of spreadsheets, meetings, and promotions as I climbed the corporate ladder. Meanwhile, Michelle seemed happy hopping from one shopping spree to another. Our lives couldn't have been more different, but I'd learned to accept it, or so I thought. Then, on an ordinary Saturday, everything changed. Mom called, her voice shaky. Barbara, it's Michelle. She's back home. Nicholas left her. He said she's too shallow, too focused on spending his money. He called her stupid. Can you believe it? And then she signed a prenup. She has nothing. A wave of emotions hit me. Shock, concern, and if I was honest, a tiny flicker of vindication. I quickly pushed that feeling aside, ashamed of myself. I'm coming over, I said, already grabbing my keys. When I arrived at my parents' house, it felt like stepping into a war zone. I could hear Michelle screaming from the driveway. Inside, it was chaos. Michelle was in the living room, mascara streaked down her face, her designer clothes disheveled. She was throwing anything within reach, vases, picture frames, cushions. "He can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice raw with anger and despair. "I'm Michelle. I'm beautiful. I'm perfect," she cried, her voice filled with rage and tears. Mom and Dad hovered around her, trying desperately to calm her down. "Sweetie, please," Mom pleaded. "We'll figure this out. Dad will buy you a new dress, won't you, dear?" Dad nodded quickly. "Of course, princess. Anything you want." I stood there, watching this strange scene unfold, feeling like I had stepped into an alternate reality. This couldn't be how life was supposed to work, could it? As the days passed, Michelle's tantrums didn't stop. She'd cry for hours, then scream, then demand expensive gifts to make herself feel better. And our parents, eager to keep her happy, gave her everything she asked for. One evening, after another meltdown, I couldn't hold back any more. "Maybe," I said carefully, "Michelle should consider getting a job. It might help her appreciate the value of money and give her something to focus on." The room fell silent. Then, all at once, chaos erupted. Michelle's face twisted in anger. "A job? Like you, slaving away every day like some peasant." She spat. Bursting into tears, she ran upstairs, slamming her door so hard the whole house shook. Before I could even process what had happened, Mom and Dad turned on me. "How dare you?" Mom hissed. "Your sister is going through a terrible time, and you suggest she lower herself to your levels." I didn't mean it like that. I tried to explain, but they weren't listening. "Get out," Dad said, his voice cold. "Get out of this house right now," Mom added, pointing at the door. "And don't come back until you can be supportive of your sister." In a daze, I grabbed my purse and left. When I walked into my apartment, my sanctuary, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness at being rejected by my family, anger at their blindness to Michelle's faults, and oddly, a sense of relief. For the first time, I saw how toxic my family had been all these years. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. Just days after the blow-up with my family, I got news that left me stunned. I had won a company contest. The prize, a 5-month, all-expenses-paid cruise around the world. In a moment of weakness, or maybe hope, I decided to call my parents. Maybe this good news could heal the rift between us. "Mom, Dad, you won't believe it. I won a cruise around the world." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then my mother's cold voice broke through. "Barbara, how can you be so selfish? Your sister is going through a terrible time, and you're bragging about vacations?" As though I had been slapped. I said softly, not flaunting anything. "I simply considered." Mom interrupted me, though. "If you had any decency, you would assign that ticket to Michelle," she remarked harshly. "She requires a change of environment. As usual, you can stay home and work." Something inside of me caught fire. Years of irritation burst all at once. "No," I responded with great force. "I was going on this trip. I obtained it. Michelle made poor decisions, so I am not giving it up. I'm traveling." The next several weeks passed in a haze as I prepared. I arranged everything at work, packed my luggage, and on the day of departure, I did something I had never done before. I turned off my cell phone. I felt free for the first time in many years. The cruise fulfilled all I had imagined. In Malta, I saw breathtaking sunsets. In Romania, I saw old ruins, and I strolled through Singapore's crowded streets. I was just Barbara for 4 amazing months, not the family failure or the responsible older sister. All good things, nevertheless, have to fade. Reality struck when the ship grounded back home. Turning on my phone, I expected a deluge of messages, but only a handful of my parents' missed calls. I headed home feeling lighter than I had in years. Heard sounds inside my apartment as I got closer. My pulse thumped. Had somebody broken in? With caution opening the door, she was there. Michelle. She was stretched on my couch, surrounded by empty takeout containers and shopping bags. Michelle, said. I started to gasp. What are you doing here? She looked up, barely reacting to my sudden arrival. Oh, you're back, finally. I stood frozen, my keys still in my hand. How did you get in here? She rolled her eyes. Don't be dramatic, Barbara. I used the spare keys you left with Mom and Dad. I needed a change of scenery. Everything at home reminded me of, you know. I stared at her, speechless. This was too much. I need air, I muttered, grabbing my car keys and heading outside. But when I got to the parking lot, my car was gone. Panic set in as I called my parents. Mom picked up, her voice overly cheerful. Barbara, dear, how was your trip? Where's my car? I cut straight to the point. There was a pause, and then Dad came on the line. We sold it. The world seemed to spin. You what? Michelle needed cheering up. Mom said casually, as if it were no big deal. We used the money to take her shopping and to the spa. What I was hearing defied belief. That was my car. You had nowhere right. I yelled. Dad's voice then cut in, sharp and contemptuous. Now, Barbara, we are a family. That is yours. Ours is what is. Do not act selfishly. I snapped something inside of me. Years of frustration, bitterness, and wrath spilled all at once. Selfish. You raided my house, stole my automobile, and I am selfish. I want my money taken back. Now, their response was sharp and instantaneous. They branded me a letdown, unappreciative, heartless. Stung, but for the first time they did not break me. Completely blind to the tempest within me, I hung up the phone, marched back into my flat, and found Michelle still asleep on my couch. Get out, I said softly but forcefully. Startled, Michelle turned to gaze up. Wonderful. Exit, currently. She tried to argue, to dominate me as usual, but this time I moved nothing. For the first time, I started first. The next day, I sued my parents for the worth of my car and paid a lawyer. Furious, they swore to disavow me and cut me from their will. I did not, nonetheless, back off. That matter came before the court. Laying years of financial abuse and emotional manipulation for strangers to hear was exhausting. Still, at least justice was done. My parents had to sell their house to pay for back-off since the judge determined in my favor, declaring to everyone who would listen that I was the villain who had destroyed their life. They moved into a modest apartment. Once more, though, their words did not reach me. New from the showroom, my new car made me lighter on the road. First in my life, I felt quite free, released from their expectations, under control and under manipulation. Chose grudgingly to cut off all contact with my family. The first few months were hard. One could sometimes be doubtful and lonely, but I began to live on my own terms gradually. At work, I gave it everything and moved quickly up the ladder. New individuals I encountered valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. I moved, developed new interests, and discovered enjoyment in everyday objects. Mostly, I came to enjoy me, to esteem my strength, will, and worth. I smile now as I sit in my office peering out over the city skyline. Though not easy, it was mine. I made this life step by step, decision after decision. I would not change anything.